Thank you for joining us today for the Spectrum Filling the Pipeline panel as part of the CTIA 5G Summit. And thank you to our panelists for joining us today. We have Ron Repasi, the Chief of the Office of Engineering and Technology at the Federal Communications Commission. We have Jayne Stancavage, Global Executive Director of Digital Infrastructure at Intel, and Hank Hultquist, Vice President of Federal Regulatory at AT&T. And I'm Jayne Oberhausen, Director of Regulatory Affairs at CTIA. So thank you to all of you for joining us today. As the wireless industry looks to the future, refilling the spectrum pipeline will be important to meet the ever-growing need for wireless services. And today we're going to discuss emerging technologies, global spectrum developments, and particular spectrum bands on the horizon to meet future consumer needs. But at the outset, I will just remind all of you that the FCC's prohibited communications quiet period is in effect for Auction 107, and that therefore we will not discuss auction bids, bidding strategies, pricing information, post-auction market structure, or any issue that could affect an applicant's bidding strategy. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's kick it off. It's no secret that in terms of spectrum, CTIA has focused on 2020 as the year of mid-band spectrum. So to recap what's happened so far, earlier this year, the Commission completed an auction for priority access licenses in the 3.5 gigahertz CBRS band. The Commission is set to kick off the auction for 280 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.7 gigahertz C-band in December of this year. And more recently, the Commission worked very closely with the administration to make an additional 100 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.45 gigahertz band available for 5G. So today we'll focus on a more forward-looking discussion on emerging technologies, global spectrum developments, and particular spectrum bands on the horizon to meet consumer needs going forward. So let's start off with a free-for-all question. Any one of you are welcome to jump in here, but if you had to make a prediction looking forward, now that 5G is rolling out across the country, what new use cases will drive increasing mobile data usage and demand for additional spectrum?
Okay, I'll jump in, Jen. Really, I think after the events of 2020, it really is a little daunting to make predictions. The world seems to have a way of upsetting our expectations, and I think none of us would have predicted a year ago when we were in Los Angeles that this year there would be so much emphasis on the two-way video communications that have taken place. So I'll start by caveating and saying, I don't really know. I'm not a futurist. I'm a regulatory guy. What I do know, though, is I do think video applications in a variety of types. I mean, we've seen, obviously, telehealth has had a significant uptick this year. I think video applications and use cases will continue to grow. We know that 5G brings a suite of capabilities, speed, lower latency, resiliency, security, the ability to connect many, many devices, that ultimately those capabilities, I think, will be at the heart of the use cases that evolve as we go forward. As I said, I hesitate to predict exactly what they will be.
Thanks, Jayne. What about you?
Jen,
Yeah,
I would add on. I think Hank's right. Like, let's not because we're not very good at that, at least this year. But definitely the video, and I think now more than ever, people realize how important digital connectivity is. It is part of our lives and will be going forward. Regardless of anything. But all of the things that have changed for the last few years with 4G deployments are very human-centric, right? It changes the way that we as individuals interact with the world via your phone, whether it's, day-to-day activities or everything sort of focuses around that. But as we move towards 5G, I think you're going to see that same type of innovation that we don't know, but now we're putting that capability in the hands vertical industries, so industrial, retail, banking, finance, any of automotive, those sectors now have the ability to take that connectivity and remove all kinds of barriers and innovate. And I think the answer is we don't know because the people who are going to create it are not here in this room. They're everywhere else.
Thanks, Jayne. Anything you want to add, Ron?
Sure. I also do not tend to make wild predictions on what might come up in the next year, let alone the next couple of months. But I think there's one thing generally we can expect is that data-rich applications to mobile users is going to be a driving force for spectrum demand. I think things like virtual reality, augmented reality to mobile end users is something that is on the horizon, as well as industrial IoT type operations, machine-to-machine operations. I think we'll all be factoring into spectrum demand, and it's something that we look at broadly from a commission standpoint, and a way to address that and a way to make opportunities for various types of use cases versus trying to predict what particular one might prevail or be predominant, is to get a good mix of low band, high band, and mid band spectrum into play into the marketplace to support any type of use case or application that might come about, perhaps within the next few weeks.
Thanks, Ron. So Hank and Jayne, from your perspective, where should industry and policymakers be focusing their efforts in terms of making sure that sufficient spectrum is available to meet future demand for wireless services?
Obviously, there's a lot of interest and excitement about the 3.45 to 3.55 band that work is beginning on. I think, the industry and AT&T is also interested in spectrum below 3.45. So we'll be interested to see how that plays out. After that, I think we really need to have a conversation about where are the places that we look to get more spectrum in the pipeline and start to take the steps to make sure that it will become available at a time when we can use it. So I think, the next step is really the crystal ball question.
Jayne, and to add on to that question, are there particular gaps where spectrum availability in the United States doesn't match up with developments in other countries?
Yes, so definitely during the last work cycle, for instance, different bands, but even before that, you see a lot of mid-band spectrum that looks different. So there's definitely interest in some of the lower parts of 3 gigahertz, for instance. There's activity right now on Agenda 1 that's looking at the 4.899 gigahertz band. And even if you go back to three work cycles ago now, the 1427 to 1518 megahertz band was adopted very widely. There were only 2 countries in the world that were really not moving forward with that band, and the United States was one of them. And we were looking just below that at 1300 to 1400, but that was not available either. So those are some of the key bands, the 1427 to 1518 megahertz band, and then spectrum in that 3.3 to 5 gigahertz tuning range.
Yeah, thanks, Jayne. And I think I heard you correctly there, but if I could just ask you to repeat that part about the previous WRC cycles and where the rest of the world has spectrum versus the U.S. I think just to make sure we caught you on that one.
Well, let's see how many cycles we're going to go back. So 2 cycles ago, the rest of the world adopted 1427, 1518 megahertz. So almost a spectrum. There are 2 countries in the world that didn't move forward with that, the United States being one of them. So that would be one place to look. And just below that, domestically, we were looking at spectrum between 1300 and 1400. That may be something in there as well. And then there's interest in other countries in this work cycle in some of the lower 3 gigahertz, and then also at the top of that 3.3 to 5 gigahertz tuning range at the 8 to 4.99. There is an agenda item looking at that.
And I think both of you touched a little bit on how long it sometimes takes to get that spectrum to market. And I thought, Ron, can you describe, what has to happen at the FCC to open new spectrum bands for wireless use? What does that process typically look like from start to finish? How long does it take? Can you expand on that a little bit?
It can be a pretty cumbersome process. It's important to understand the incumbencies in the spectrum. For example, when we go through a reallocation rulemaking and then develop service rules for that new service that would enter into the spectrum, all the way up to the assignment approach that we would take, whether it's a geographic area license or a site-by-site license. All these things factor into what the ultimate radio frequency environment would look like when it comes to the final rules. But the incumbents play an important role in designing the technical and operational rules that would be arrived at to come up with the sharing environment and perhaps a relocation transition plan strategy for incumbents to move to a new band. From the sharing perspective, the Commission tends to focus on four general areas. And the recent CBRS auction is a culmination of these four sharing areas. One is through geographic separation, the other is through frequency separation. Another is the difference in the power levels among the users accessing the spectrum. And the fourth is time, sharing it from a time perspective. And CBRS, the SAS system, the Spectrum Authorization System, it's the traffic cop, so to speak, for those four areas. So this is the first time that all four of those types of sharing areas have been employed in an elaborate, complex sharing environment like the CBRS. So the process then, you ask, how long does it take? There's no real general rule of thumb. I think most would argue it takes too long. Others would argue it's happening too fast. It depends on if you're the incumbent or you're the person who would like to access the spectrum, right? So I think we get it just right when we take into account the incumbencies in the spectrum, as well as the need to find access to the spectrum for new and innovative services. So I think we strike that balance from a commission perspective in getting new bands into play.
If you could, do you have any advice on how industry can better engage with government stakeholders to facilitate that process when we are, whether we're talking about commercial or federal spectrum? Anything you can offer on that, I think our audience would love to hear it.
One thing that I would suggest is continue, and I stress the word continue, to work in good faith with government stakeholders. And I know from an industry organization versus an individual licensee, those good faith conversations take place at different levels, right? From an industry perspective, recognizing that federal agencies, federal government stakeholders are using radio frequency spectrum to meet mission requirements. They have a different perspective on the need for access to the spectrum, and also recognize that a disruption in the mission, a disruption in the spectrum access could lead to a disruption in the mission. And I think the industry gets that. I think there's a general understanding that it's not that you can just relocate carte blanche everything that's on the federal government side. That said, again, it goes to the incumbencies, understanding and having an appreciation for the government stakeholder incumbencies that are in the spectrum, recognizing you can't have access to all the information you might need to come up with some of the refined coordination mechanisms that everybody might appreciate in the rulemaking process that I described earlier. But the other thing comes to the point of assignment. When you get from the service rule to the assignment process, where you actually have licensees then that could work with federal stakeholders, government stakeholders, the good faith negotiations can become a little more involved, because you can enter into non-disclosure agreements with the federal stakeholders and perhaps come up with more refined technical and operational techniques that you can employ from an individual licensee perspective to get closer into where those government stakeholders might be operating their particular system, or come up with an arrangement for both the government needs to be met from a mission perspective, as well as the licensees' expectations and being able to fully access the spectrum in that area.
So how does this conversation fit together with developments in international fora, such as the ITU and the World Radio Conference, noting that, as you mentioned, WRC in 2023 will consider an agenda item exploring mid-band spectrum for IMT or 5G, as it's known?
So there's different parts. There's obviously a tension, right? The U.S. tends to be one of the first leading countries in the world on some bands, and then other bands, the rest of the world seems to coalesce around, and the U.S. doesn't have part of that. So we definitely want to make sure that the U.S. Bands are available, that we're able to benefit from any economies of scale, and that the technical rules adopted by the FCC and that the licensees are using are consistent and permitted within the international regulations. So we want to make sure that the U.S. has that ability to move forward, and that our rules are respected and permitted under international law. But we also want to make sure that to the extent we're able to capitalize on some of the other bands that are under consideration, some of the lower 3 gigahertz, for instance, is being studied. Some of the 48 to 499 that's being studied. anything that we can do to capitalize on some of those bands as well.
And given the global reach of your business, how do you think about international harmonization, and how do you plan for differences in spectrum availability in different regions of the world?
Well, tuning ranges have made my job a lot easier. So in the past, we would have had to do a different piece of hardware for every different country that had a different band plan. The United States frequently had a band plan than everywhere else. That would require a different piece of hardware, a different piece of hardware, for instance, for Brazil and Russia with a different band, Germany with a different band plan. But now with tuning ranges, if we have that, you could take anything, for instance, between 3.3 and 5 gigahertz in that tuning range. The US makes pieces of it available. Brazil makes a different piece of that available. Germany makes a different piece of that available. The same piece of hardware will operate in all three countries. So you get the economies of scale and the roaming, and it really allows the operators to be able to buy that same equipment and utilize it in their networks no matter where it is.
I think we at CTIA would certainly agree with that. So if we could ask one final question, and I'll open this up to each of you. I'm going to ask you to do what you were hesitant to do in the beginning, but if you had to predict, what do you think will be the most important spectrum-related development in 2021?
In my mind, there's a couple. Maybe the most important spectrum-related development is really what happens here domestically, from my perspective, with the election, with the administration, with new FCC, and how that impacts spectrum policy. I think that's going to be a critical development. And the most exciting, I guess, will be the auctions that are upcoming. And so I would say what happens with the new administration in January and the auctions, I would say, are the two most important developments I see domestically.
Just to continue on with Hank's point about the auctions, and this is a bit of a prediction as well, that the conclusion, I think it's a solid prediction, that the C-band auction, the 3.7 gigahertz auction, will conclude early next year, and then the 3450 auction would be initiated in 2021. And that represents a pretty significant improvement in the form of harmonization and tuning ranges. To Jayne's point earlier, the combination of 3.7 CBRS and then 3450 would put on the order of 530 megahertz of spectrum into play in that mid-band range of spectrum that is actually harmonized from an ITU perspective. All three regions of the world have spectrum for allocations for mobile and fixed services throughout that 3 gigahertz range of spectrum, as well as the standards that are going on in 3GPP. There are a couple of band classes that overlap all of the work that the Commission has done from a mid-band perspective. So the conclusion of the 3.7 and the initiation of the 3450 auction, I think, are going to be pretty big milestones from a 2021 standpoint.
They picked the obvious ones, right? Which I should have jumped in the queue first for that one. So I agree that the biggest news and the loudest news will definitely be the auctions. There's nothing even close. I think some of the most exciting news will be starting to see some of these innovations happening in the use cases. And I think probably one of the most important is the point that Hank raised at the beginning, question that needs to happen, because this is a long game, right? It's a long-term issue, and it's never over. And so all of this will be happening, and we can't stop and catch our breath. Well, maybe for one day, we can take a day to celebrate, and then we have to move on to those questions, because that demand is not going to abate.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
One day. We get one day to celebrate.
Thank you, Jayne.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you, Jayne, and thanks to you, Hank, and Ron as well. Really appreciate you joining us today, and thank you for your remarks.